Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Keith Preston to discuss, can a society exist without elites? Tim.
You, Keith, a while back posted a video by Wayne Price, which I watched, on Do Marxists and Anarchists Agree? And it seems that on the ends, Marxists agree with, in practice, on the question of elites. This was the question. One of the questions I thought was in the video was, could a society without elites exist? And I think on the fringes, they do, in a way, agree. Murray Rothbard, especially the young one, is very much an anarchist who has a lot of American-style left anarchism in there. And by the question of elites, I think we need to sort of define, what types of elites you could ask. Could a society without elites exist? Well, what type of elites? I think there's a famous guy who says the bootmaker. I think in your interview with Brent Langel, or debate, I shall say, Brent cited, you both more or less agree with the authority of the bootmaker. So let's say an elite bootmaker. But I think there's a big difference between bootmakers and, let's say, the Bidens or the Clintons or the Rothschilds or something like that, or the Rockefellers. I think there's probably a big difference. But it's more of a difference in degrees here. So you could sort of define what types of elites would exist. In our current society, we do clearly have a kind of elite. I think that's quite obvious. And we also do have a sort of petty elite too. But you also see elites. Elite could be an innocuous word. You have an elite basketball player or an elite chess player. We had an interview with Todd Lewis recently, and that was one of the points I made. It's like, it seems like there can be elite intellectuals, elite athletes. It doesn't seem like that's a problem. And this is sort of what Jordan Peterson is, even all much maligned. I generally agree with a lot of the criticisms of him. He'll talk about competence. Some people are better at, some people can't. You get the mentally handicapped or retarded or whatever politically correct word you want to use. So those people are clearly unelite, shall we say. So generally speaking, do you think a society without elites can exist? Can a society without, let's say, a ruling class exist? And if there are any examples, what would they be? Thanks for being on, Keith.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think one thing that you've already touched on is the question of what are the elites and what are the different kinds of elites and what kind of elites should we find objectionable. And usually when we talk about elites, we talk about what C. Wright Mills called the power elite. That is, the people who actually have power in society and can command the actions of others. I mean, those are really the kinds of elites we need to be the most concerned about. And elites come in different forms. There's the political elite, the people who actually run the state. There's the financial elite and the economic elite, the people that are top of the pyramid economically, and they might be different reasons why they got there. But some may have inherited their position. Some may be, particularly successful investors. Some may be particularly successful entrepreneurs, with or without the assistance of government. And then, of course, you have the elites of, say, the military and various professions. The members of the Supreme Court are part of the elite. So you've got the elite that span the spectrum of political institutions, legal institutions, economic institutions, educational institutions, the media, military institutions, technology, science, all of these things. I will say that I don't think you can have a society without experts. There are going to always have to be experts and always will be experts. There's going to be some people who are simply better at repairing an automobile than others. There are going to be people who are better at doing gene splicing than others. Different people have different abilities, different motivations, different interests, different learning styles, different kinds of intelligences. So I think there always is going to be some kind of system of experts. The question is, how do you prevent experts from becoming an elite? Now, not all elites are necessarily experts. Like when we look at some of the political elites that we see today, it's hard to determine what exactly they would be experts at. Deceit maybe, or guile, or something like that. But expertise is not the same thing as being elite per se. There are some people who are elite simply because they were born into the right family. It's nothing they did due to any merits of their own. I think that's really the distinction that has to be made. So the question is one of power. How do we prevent power from becoming so concentrated that we have a kind of artificially privileged elite? Not somebody who is elite because, well, they were a better runner, so they did better in the track meet or contest, or somebody's physically stronger, so they were a better boxer or something like that. We'll always have elites of that type. But when we actually talk about people who have power to tell other people what to do, can we do without elites of that type? The right libertarian or conservative libertarian response to that tends to be, well, we have to distinguish between meritorious elites and non-meritorious elites. And usually they break it down into the market versus state dichotomy. They'll say, well, somebody who is successful through entrepreneurship or just superior skill or pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps or something like that. Somebody like that is a natural elite and a rightful elite. And perhaps if somebody like that is, say, the CEO of a company, well, maybe there's a good reason for it, and maybe they earned their position. The more left view is that you have a system of elites that's based on a system of exploitation. That the economically privileged got there by making other people poor or taking advantage of other people. The left tends to be more critical of economic elites. The right tends to be more critical of political elites. Although I don't think you can totally separate them. I am an elite theorist in the sense that of all the different sociological schools that try to understand how societies work, I tend to agree with the elite theorist, and there's a lot of different types of elite theorists. So my own views are kind of eclectic, but I do think that if we want to look at how our modern societies work, we can make an analogy to something like the Middle Ages. Like if we look at the Middle Ages, we see that you had the royal elites, the royal families. You had the aristocratic elites, which tended to be the hereditary, titled, large landowners and things like that. And then you had the clerical elites, the person holding high-ranking status in the church. And then you had military elites, and you had merchant elites and all that kind of stuff too. And you have the modern equivalent of that. In modern societies, you have the political elite, the economic elite, the academic elite, the professional elite, the military elite. And the media elite is a big one. In fact, even though in the United States we've never had royalty or a formal aristocracy, we've more than made up for that by making presidents and their families into a new royalty, like particularly the way the Kennedy family historically was venerated by the American society. And we do that with celebrities. I mean, the Kardashians. I mean, the Kardashians are just our version of the Windsors or one of the European royal families or something like that. That raises a lot of questions. Is that just something that is endemic to American society, or just endemic to human society? Is that just something people do? They just create elites of this type for whatever reason. If you don't have one kind of elite, you'll have another kind. Or is it something that could theoretically be eliminated? To me, again, the issue was power. What do elites actually do? I mean, how much control can they exercise over the wider society, over the lives of other people? And in that sense, yeah, we obviously have an elite. Jeff Bezos is part of the elite. Joe Biden's part of the elite. The CEO of BlackRock is part of the elite. The CEO of MSNBC is part of the elite. To me, it's a question of power. To what degree is power concentrated? And the question that follows after that is it possible to avoid concentrations of power to such a degree that you don't produce an elite? Like, for example, in industries, we have, if you all the major industries, whether it's manufacturing or healthcare or whatever, is it possible for industries that provide basic services or manufacture basic products, is it possible for those to be structured in a way that you don't create a hierarchical elite of top executives or top investors that then have the means of essentially controlling the government through buying politicians and things like that? Can power within industrial organizations and economic organizations be dispersed in a way that it doesn't create that kind of imbalance of power? Same thing with politics. I mean, can you abolish government or strip government down or localize the government or whatever to the point that you're not going to have highly concentrated elites that have far-reaching powers? But the thing is, even at the local level, you do find elites. Like in the United States, even when you look at local power, local politics, you see that local city councils and things like that tend to be controlled by what amounts to an oligarchy or oligopoly of real estate interest and the most powerful local businesses and things like that. The Chamber of Commerce and the local banking institutions. And you seem to see this at every layer. So I think that all societies are going to have experts. The question is, how do you distinguish between experts on one hand and mere power holders on the other? And how can you structure society in a way that you're not going to have excessive concentrations of power in the hands of different kinds of power holders? And that's really the dilemma. I think it's possible to have fewer elites than more. Is it possible to do away with them entirely? That I'm not so sure about.
You made the comment about merit. I think merit. Do the elites have merits? And I think if you push the right libertarians, the good ones, they actually agree with the left libertarians, well, the left anarchists, or even the Marxists for that matter, more. Hans Hoppe had a lecture, What Marx Gets Right. And most, Rothbard, of course, has the article about businessmen aren't the most exploited, or whatever. It was in response to Ayn Rand's article. So me and Swithin recently went through like the 110 richest people in the world. And I think we found that all top 10 are dodgy by Rothbardian standards here. Now, whether libertarians in practice do that or not is a good question. I will say that on the other side of the political spectrum, the left isn't always. They do have a kind of Fauci or certain types of climate change or certain types of other quote unquote experts. They have I'd argue a little too much. They treat them a little too much like nobility to be just simple like if you're getting a jet engine fixed or you're getting a tooth fixed. It's a little more than that. So my next question would be along the lines: can there be elites who aren't exploitative? Right. This could be almost a term problem here, where if elite just means illegitimate power, and an illegitimate power, the only way you get that position is through that. Of course, by definition, there can't be illegitimate power here. And I do like the elites. One of the things I think that interests me about you is I would say the Marxists somewhat historicalize a specific order of relations, which it's like you're talking about like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, for example. It's unclear whether, or even the Spartans, unclear whether the Marxist economics ideas that described by the historical Marxists even work. But elite theory, that makes sense. It's more cross-cultural and cross-time here. So what would you make? Can there be elites who aren't? It's quite clear that Bill Gates gained his power through IP and other sort of inside, you can make the claims, inside trading of some variety, money, debt. You can, there's a long litany of traits. You take any individual billionaire. But of course, the Bidens or the Clintons, the state power, these are the ones that the right libertarians would attack. They also are a kind of unmerited elite. But at some point along the line, oftentimes you find someone in their family did do something somewhat productive, whatever it may be. Although maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's just all theft or whatever you want to call all the way down. But what would you make of it? Can there be such thing as a non-exploitative elite, or is that just a word salad? Keith?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The way that you started that off was interesting because you were talking about reviewing the list of people who are the wealthiest people. I think a lot of those lists are deceptive because usually when you look at the list of the world's 100 or 500 richest people or whatever, it's usually a collection of hedge fund managers and tech entrepreneurs and people of that type, the Bill Gates types. But I actually think there's a lot of stuff left off of those lists that I think are more significant. The true measure of wealth is not what you personally own, but your ability to command resources. A good example are these televangelists like we have in the United States who may not personally own a private jet. It may be in the name of their church or some nonprofit foundation or something like that, but they still own it for all practical purposes because they use it whenever they want to. That's the real measure of wealth. And if we measure wealth in that way, I think there's a lot of people who are more wealthy, or a lot of groups that are more wealthy than the ones that we typically see on these formal lists of the world's most wealthy. Like I suspect that, like usually these lists of the most wealthy, they're these multi-billionaires, the Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and people like that. But I suspect if you look at the actual wealth of some of the royal families in Europe and in the Middle East, that probably, some of them are probably approached being trillionaires. Like I would guess that the royal family of Saudi Arabia are probably trillionaires. And also you have to look at the way wealth is distributed through families and then through informal organizations that are controlled by a very narrow sector of people. I think so. It's really not so much even the billionaires that are the elites. It's the de facto trillionaires that are the elites. But as far as whether you can have non-exploitative elites, there's always the question of how do you even define exploitation? The left, the Marxists and the left anarchists will say wage labor is exploitation. The right libertarians tend to say, well, no, only physical coercion is exploitation. Then there are some people, left and right, who take it even further and they say, no, psychological manipulation is exploitation, or whatever. So there's a big question about how do you even define that. I think that the question of whether you can have elites that are either very powerful or very wealthy who aren't doing something that would normally be considered crooked in any other context, I tend to think that's probably fairly doubtful. If you think about every organization, every individual out there that is part of the economic or political elite, and leaving aside the football players and all of that, most of them, I think, if you look into their background, you see that they either inherited their position, maybe that's okay, but they either inherited their position or they gained the system somehow, either economically or politically, or often both, or they benefited heavily from some pre-existing arrangement that was already set up to create an imbalance of power. And if you stripped all that away, it's interesting how you have a lot of people who claim to be free market economists, but they're really not if you listen to the things they say, because I've actually, aside from the most hardcore libertarians, I've never really met very many free market economists who were, say, against government printing money, government building roads, government in issuing patents, all these very basic things that government does that create an economic system. If there was no patents, how would that affect the economy? Like if, for example, if there was no such thing as trademarks, if I, Keith Preston, could go and open a restaurant and just call it McDonald's and use the McDonald's golden arches if I felt like, and And if the McDonald's company said, well, you've got to pay us a franchise fee or royalties or whatever, I just gave them the middle finger and said, no, this is a free enterprise. You've got your McDonald's, I've got my McDonald's. If you could do that in a free market economy, which I think that would be a free market economy, a real free market economy would work like that, because you would not have the state enforcing trademarks and patents and intellectual property. How would that change economic life? I think it would change it in a way that was very, very, very far-reaching. Even like I said, even at the local level, it's interesting to look at the way in which laws that are that are enacted at the state and local level, forget about national governments and world trade systems and all that. Even the way county and city governments are structured in terms of their laws, zoning is used to constrict the supply of housing, which raises the cost of housing. Business licensing is used to keep people who are smaller competitors from entering particular markets. All kinds of public nuisance and public order regulations are basically used to protect middle-class lifestyles from competition from more lumpen sectors. If you stripped away all of that, what kind of economic system would you have? I don't know, but I do think, though, that, I'm of two minds on this, because I think that at every level, the kind of systems that we're used to are created to prop up an elite, an exploitive elite, or specially privileged or artificially privileged elite. On the other hand, I also tend to think that organizations of any size tend to be oligarchies. I tend to agree with Robert Michaels and thinkers like that. Like, say, for example, anarcho-syndicalism as a theory. You have anarcho-syndicalists who say, well, we don't believe in capitalists, or we don't want to have an industrial system that's controlled by, say, investors and CEOs. We want to have an industrial system that's run by unions, and we're going to have a federation of unions, and then in different industries, each industry is going to be managed by its own workers' union that's organized democratically. Right, but I still think in a system like that, you'd have a de facto oligarchy, because, for one thing, any kind of democracy tends to be an oligarchy of special interests, if for no other reason, because you have people that are just more motivated to seek out power and influence in a group like that. Also, power tends to centralize itself very easily. It's very hard to maintain a non-centralized system of power, particularly when you're dealing with a large organization. On the other hand, there are organizations that exist even on a transnational level that are very large, and I guess you could debate whether they're exploitive or not, but they're still largely voluntary. One of the most interesting examples is the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches is an international federation of representing different Protestant church denominations, and I think the Catholic Church has its own, observers, or I think the Catholic Church doesn't belong to the World Council of Churches, but they have a relationship. And I've read that theoretically that the World Council of Churches represents about 2 billion people, because it represents most of the mainline Protestant churches and the Catholic Church. I think some of the evangelicals and more fundamentalist Protestants refuse to participate in it. But so this is a worldwide organization that theoretically represents many, many smaller organizations, which includes collectively billions of people. But it's still a largely voluntary organization. There are very few countries today where any kind of Christian church is the state church in a way that has real power. I mean, yeah, you've got the Church of England. I think in Argentina, the Catholic Church is the official church, but that's not the same thing as what it was in the Middle Ages. It's not the kind of theocracy, the real theocracy that you see somewhere like Saudi Arabia. So Christian churches in the modern world are largely voluntary organizations, and they are organized often on a transnational and in many ways a highly centralized basis. But they're still voluntary, because nobody really has to belong to them that doesn't want to. And then there's also the question of but they still have a hierarchy, or they still have an internal oligarchy, like the Pope is still the oligarch, the monarch of the Catholic Church. But yeah, like he doesn't really get a lot of respect from people who don't like the Catholic Church. It's not like it's against the law to insult them or anything like that. So, is that really a system of elites? How elite is that? I suppose I could personally deal with a system of elites where it's kind of like what the World Council of Churches is, where it's a bunch of organizations that nobody has to belong to if they don't want to, and it's not like a crime to insult the leadership or anything. Although a lot of whenever I debate this with leftists, though, they go on and on about, well, there's psychological exploitation, there's emotional exploitation, children are brainwashed into the religion of their parents, and what about the freedom of children? I mean, you can take this, you can take these ideas way out on a limb, I guess, and I mean, I don't know. I suppose you could say that if one kid can run faster than the other, the slow kid is being exploited or something. But what I tend to be concerned about are real systems of real power, where the state can kill you, or where maybe the leader of a company, a business, can't really order you to be sentenced to death, but they can use their economic power to control the state and write laws in their own interest. Those are the kinds of systems of power and domination and exploitation and elitism that I tend to be interested in or critical of. And I think the question is, how do you go about rolling that back?
That's interesting, the last thing you said there, Keith, because what I was going to ask you was how do you understand power? I mean, you've mentioned it a little bit earlier and just now. It reminds me because I was reading some I was reading some feminist sociology a number of months ago, and they kept going on about power all the time in the patriarchy. And I kept thinking, okay, what actually constitutes power? And so Tim and I, many episodes back, did an episode on what is power. I was going to give a very brief overview of that and see what your thoughts are on it and where you'd locate what you thought were the most important parts of power. It seemed to me that the best way of understanding power was the means to achieve your goals. That would seem to be a reasonable way of defining the term. And you could make a distinction, say, between power over nature and power over people. So I referred to like power over nature as physical power, being able to transform the external environment into something habitable, like air conditioning, for instance, in Las Vegas. And then the one we're probably more interested in here, power over people. And you've used some of these terms so far. So effectively economic power, which I've defined as the ability to acquire other goods and services by essentially selling your own. So via exchange, effectively. And then the one that I think seems to be at the bottom of the exploitation, although, again, how you define this properly, what I refer to as violent power, which is basically legal, but it could also be sort of like what would be more straightforward criminal, sort of threatening violence against people just on the street or whatever. You then are going to have what I refer to as relational power, which seems to be best described in kind of media influence. Effectively, you can change people's goals by propaganda or just general influence within the media. So, I mean, back, say, a year or so ago, that there was general feeling that if you didn't wear a mask inside, you were somehow killing people. And then it kind of created social norms of shame that people decided, oh, no, I better wear a mask just because, I don't want to look the odd man out, for instance. Then you have like persuasive power. You just convince people. You're convincing, go and buy this product, or go and sell your car, or you can just persuade people. And then ones that are not hugely important necessarily: intellectual power, the ability to understand the world; spiritual power, the ability to come closer to the ultimate, whatever you want to define that as. I was trying to be comprehensive. So of those broad types, which would you say are the sort of ones which are open to sort of exploitation and abuse? The reason I ask this is just power tends to be used quite loosely by a lot of people. And so trying to really nail down from the elites and what we mean by power, I think could be quite useful.
Yeah. Back in the 1930s, Bertrand Russell put out a book on power. I think it's just called Power, where he reviewed a lot of the different types of power as he defined them. And there was what he called naked power, which is just the power to basically force somebody to do something, either through threat of physical coercion or something like that. There's also economic power. There's also the power of public opinion. There's also what Max Weber called charismatic power. That is, you are an individual that you command power just because people like you or they respect your position or something like that. Kind of like the Pope or somebody of that nature. That's a religious leader. There's hierarchical power, but then there's also what Russell called revolutionary power. That is power stemming from the bottom up. Where people overthrow a government or just mob action, mob rule or something like that. So power can come from a lot of different sources, as you just described. I think the most important definition of power, meaning of power, is the ability to command the actions of others. Like if I want to tell other people what to do, how do I make them comply? There's a number of ways in which that can happen. The obvious, one of the most brute types of power is physical coercion. You have certain elites that they can more or less tell other people what to do under threat of physical coercion. You have other contexts where somebody might be able to exercise power over someone through threatening their economic livelihood. Like an employer might be able to say to an employee, well, no, I can't put you in jail, but I can fire you, and then you're going to be impoverished and not be able to take care of yourself and your dependents and all of that. I think that economic power is a big deal. I come across some right libertarians that seem to think economic power is no big deal at all, and they're only concerned about actual political power, like making laws and that kind of thing. But I think economic power does matter. There's also cultural power, and I think cultural power is important. A lot of people on the libertarian left talk about that. They say, well, when you have oppressive social norms and that kind of stuff, like exclusionary attitudes towards gay people or whatever, they talk about cultural power. And I do think there's something to that. I probably wouldn't put as much emphasis on cultural power as some left libertarians do, because I do think it's tertiary compared to political and economic power. But I could conceive of a society where there was very little in the way of government, and even where perhaps economic power was fairly widely dispersed, but where the social norms were such that it was very oppressive to individuals, like say inside, within a cult or something like that, or in a society that's very, very conservative and say its religious views, like say a country like Saudi Arabia. Like I wouldn't want to be a woman or a gay person or any kind of religious minority in Saudi Arabia, irrespective of what kind of government or economic system they have. So cultural power does matter. Of course, there's military power. There's the ability to simply attack your enemies and run them over, if that's what you want to do. So all of these different kinds of power matter. But I also think there's a type of, I guess you could say there's a layer of different types of power based on their significance. Like one thing I hear a lot of people from the left in the United States complain about is they will say, well, public opinion polls show that most Americans are in favor of this or that policy, and yet the government doesn't do what Americans want them to do. Like one example in the United States is public health care. Like opinion polls will show the majority of Americans favor universal health care. And then the left, the progressives and social democrats will say, yeah, but the government ignores public opinion. They won't give us universal health care. And I do think that does without getting into a debate about whether universal health care is a good idea or public health care is a good idea, I do think that reflects a system of power. I think in the United States, we have an elite political class and an elite economic class or overlapping classes that have a type of oligarchical power that more or less does what it wants, irrespective of public opinion. And many societies work that way, and probably most, at least historically. So I do think that the most serious form of power is raw physical coercion. You can kill people, or you can physically harm people, or you can physically restrain people or incarcerate people if they don't do what you say. I think that's the most significant form of power. That's a major problem I have with a lot of leftists who think, well, government is bad, but the corporations are worse, or this or that other thing is worse. And they'll try to defend government on the grounds that it's democratic, whereas, let's say, a corporation is a hierarchy or something like that. I'm not much impressed with that line of thought. I mean, I understand it. I might agree with it in part, but I'm not much impressed with it. I mean, I think raw physical power is the most serious form of power. Economic power, that is the ability to threaten other people's livelihoods if they don't do what you want them to do, that is also a very significant form of power. So physical force and threatening other people's material well-being are the two most significant forms of power. Now, we could add to that cultural power, psychological power, charismatic power, power of public opinion, power of the people, whatever. Those are all forms of power, but it's those first forms that I think really matter the most when we're talking about elites. It's the people in society who can kill you physically, kill you economically. Those are the people who really are the real elites and who are the real power holders.
I guess the next question I'll ask is related to democracy. You sort of touched on this at the end here. Not very much impressed by the people who say, well, so many such and such majority want X, where X is healthcare and so forth, and therefore we should have it. I think one of the easiest retorts is one of the problems the left would have is, well, such and such probably want to put homosexuals in jail. And that's probably not as true as much, although you could probably still find a plurality, especially in other societies. You could definitely find where certain things are actually popular, which they don't like. Certain people would probably want to burn their enemies. So you were on with Sean Gabb. Me and Swithin did an episode about this with Todd Lewis and Sean Gabb once. And things like classical liberals, quote unquote, classical liberals defended. It's not entirely clear that they're always popular. Like trial by jury. I can imagine a lot of people didn't want Derek Chauvin to have a trial. I can imagine people didn't want. And in reverse, the Joe MacArthur types probably wouldn't want to have such and such. So just because something's a popular public opinion doesn't necessarily make it quote unquote good. So I'll posit that, but more generally about democracy. It seems like in the past, elites, and Hayek sort of gets into this why the worst gets on top. That in a society which is a quote unquote formal democracy, in the sense that now there's always the Alex Jones theory, more conspiracy minded, which is the elections are just decided in advance and so forth. But it seems like the elections in places like Britain, France, United States, they're not obviously corrupt. It's not like the votes are obviously corrupt. There might be corruption underneath or so forth, but it's not obviously corrupt. Does this process, and the franchise used to be much smaller in the 1850s than it is in the 1900s. Women, minorities, of course, weren't, and there were certain rules, and of course that property ownership was, I think, still fairly relevant, and there's voter polls and taxes, lots of things. But it sounds like we have a quote unquote formal democratic society, but it's also somewhat powerless. I mean, you could just sort of pick, I think Tom Woods has the joke, every time you get all you get is John McCain. No matter who you elect, you get John McCain. So there's one thing where voter power, you're just basically picking between parties. And as the Sandinistas found out that like the Democratic Party can create whatever rules it wants. Super delegates, sure. They can create super delegates. They can pick the questions for their preferred candidates, because the Democratic Party is not a public institution. It's a private institution, but defined by classical liberals. Hence, the existing Democratic leadership. And this is also true of the Republican Party in the United States. But, of course, Trump got through there. Ron Paul, less so. Well, Ron Paul, I forget the precise history on that. I don't want to say. But it seems to be that democracy may create worse elites. What do you make on that? That's a sort of right-wing criticism of democracy. But if I go back in history, I'm not sure if Hayek is right. What were the Bourbons or the Romanovs or better than the Clintons and the Wilsons? I'm not sure. Like, what do you make on that debate? Which side creates quote better elites? I guess the question is better. But of course, you could argue that the quote unquote democratic, this is the Hoppian, the democratic elected elites were actually worse. This is Richard Pipes' idea that the Stalinistas, to the extent they were more democratic, actually had more enemies than the Romanovs and killed more people. Although this is always a utilitarian claim. What do you make on that debate, Keith? Sorry for the long-winded question, but I sure wanted to get the point across about defining democracy because it seems like voting power is very weak. I off and on vote. I think it's a waste of time, my personal opinion, but the voting advocates would say the opposite.
Well, one point where I disagree strongly with virtually all modern liberals and leftists, and not a few people on the right either, is that I think that modern democracy is way overrated. I mean, it may be better than certain things. You know, I would rather live in any contemporary parliamentary state than in the Third Reich or in the DPRK or in some kind of system like that. But the liberal democracy, as it's commonly called, I think is largely what its critics from both the left and the right say it is. If you look at what the Marxist critique of liberal democracy is, they basically say, look, democracy is just a smokescreen. Elections are just a public ritual that's used to convey legitimacy on the real elites. And then the real elites are those who control the economic system. And there's a right-wing variation of that, usually more traditional, thrown-in-altar type conservatives use. And they will say the same thing. They will say, look, liberal democracy is basically just a step down from rule by the aristocracy and royalty to rule by the merchant class. And then it throws in an element of mob rule as well. So they will say that modern democratic republics are essentially states that are run by the commercial elites in collusion with politicians who are usually just mediocre individuals who are professional bureaucrats essentially, and then they legitimize themselves with all sorts of pageantry, and then they convince the people that they are free or have a say-so in the system simply through holding ritualistic elections every few years. And then democracy, a problem with it is that the more inclusive you make democracy, the more expansive the state actually becomes, because you have more and more groups in society that you have to do things for and you have to pander to. More people who need some kind of program to promote their own interests, more people who want laws promoting their own objectives. I think the left and right criticisms of modern liberal democracy are largely accurate. One argument that I constantly hear from American-style liberals and leftists, because in my own political outlook, I'm a big advocate of things like decentralization of political and economic power. And the most common response that I get is, yeah, but if you do that, well, somebody somewhere might be racist, or somebody might not be able to get an abortion, or somebody might discriminate against gays, as if that's the only consideration. One thing I always say in response to that is, if you look at, for example, the administration of President Lyndon Johnson that enacted the Civil Rights Act, well, what else was Lyndon Johnson doing? Well, he was escalating the Vietnam War, and things like that. If you look at the Lincoln regime in the United States that issued the Emancipation Proclamation, well, where did they go after? Where did the Union forces go after they defeated the Confederacy? Well, they went westward and started attacking the Native American nations. So there's this very, I say this a lot in the context of American politics. I'm not sure if it works the same way in other countries or not, but in American politics, the standard progressive narrative that you get is that, well, American society has been growing and improving over time. We had these founding father guys, and yeah, they had some good ideas they got from the Enlightenment or whatever, but they were also racist, sexist, homophobic, elite, aristocratic, whatever, planter class, this, that, and the other thing. But we've been gradually overcoming that. We had a war to end slavery, and we grew a larger federal government to provide everybody with Social Security, and then we passed this federal civil rights laws, a Civil Rights Act, and now we have Obamacare, and all that kind of stuff. And all of that is progress. That shows how much our society has improved over time. And of course, they always ignore the downside of that. They always ignore all the things that their heroes did. That sometimes even by the standards of the time, but certainly by today's standards, were pretty hardcore in terms of the way somebody might object to them. So I tend to be very, very skeptical of modern mass democracy on a general level. It's like for every right they give you, they take one away. One example is after they started doing away with racial segregation in the 60s and 70s, they replaced it with the war on drugs, which arguably just had just as negative an impact on, say, blacks and other poor people as segregation did, perhaps even worse of one. I think all of this is something that's really, this whole concept of mass democracy is something that's overrated. Now, democracy can exist, I think, among small groups where there's a basic shared consensus on what the basic values of the society are. As I gave the example I gave earlier of the federations, large federations of voluntary organizations like the World Council of Churches, even something like that, I guess you could say that's another type of democracy, a type of voluntary democracy or whatever. But the idea of running the state as a mass democracy is the concept that I'm just not impressed with at all. I don't see how that really has brought about any kind of progress in any meaningful sense, or at least that wasn't canceled out by some kind of problem that it created in the process.
Keith, on historical notes, is there any sort of time period or geographical area that approximates most closely, or more closely than others, your idea of decentralization and dispersal of power? I was wondering if there are any sort of historical time periods you might point to for some sort of concrete examples.
I gave a lecture about that at a conference in London I think it was in 2018. And that's available online. There's a video of it. And I also on Attack the System, which is the website that I run, on Attack the System, there's somewhere on there in the archives as a PowerPoint from that presentation. But if somebody wants to Google this, all they have to do is Google my name, Keith Preston, anarchist communities, past, present, and future. This is a very elaborate, extensive presentation I did at a conference in England in 2018. And it's got about, the PowerPoint has about 250 slides on it or something like that. So it's pretty extensive. But what I do in that is I give examples of all kinds of societies from the past, present, and future that have existed without any kind of government of an overarching nature, or where government was kept under control, or where you had stateless territories and things like that. There's a lot of variations to this. But as far as things that are more well known, a lot of anarchists will cite all kinds of historic anarchist and quasi-anarchist communities, like the left-type anarchists are big on Spain during the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. You had Aragon and Catalonia and provinces where the anarchists militias and trade organizations, labor organizations, created these anarchist collectives and communes and that kind of stuff. And a lot of the anarcho-capitalists like to look at medieval Ireland or medieval Iceland and places like that. I'd say looking at it on a bigger scale, as far as societies that existed on a large scale and with a significant amount of decentralization over a long period of time and were real civilizations, not just a commune here and there, or not just something that lasted for a few years, or not just some utopian colony. We do have examples of this. One, I think, is Greece. One of my favorites is ancient Greece. Ancient Greece existed for centuries as largely just a collection of cities. There was about 1,100 cities in ancient Greece. And we know from the writings of Aristotle that there were probably at least about 158 different systems of government in these different cities. And now that's not to say there were not plenty of things in the Greek cities that modern people would oppose. I mean, clearly there were. There was slavery, there was misogyny, and real misogyny. I mean Taliban level misogyny. There were wars between different cities. There was repression of political dissidents like Socrates, but you still had a system where you managed to have a collection of cities that were spread out over a large geographical region and largely retained their independence for centuries. And part of that was because the geographical area was very difficult to navigate, when you didn't have modern transportation technology. Also, the elites within different cities tended to be very jealous of their own prerogatives and local privileges and that kind of thing. So that kept an overarching political system from starting. Even when the Persians tried to invade Greece, the cities managed to put together enough of a coalition that they were able to repel the Persians. So Greece is one example. One example is the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire existed for, I guess, about 1,000 years. It was a federation of what amounted to hundreds of kingdoms, and then you had interstitial areas that were like free cities and independent territories and things like that, and where people more or less did what they wanted to within the context of their own areas. Now, it's also true that this was a feudal system. I'm sure liberals and progressives who hear this today, they'd say, but they had serfdom, or they had whatever. So that I'd say, yeah, it was the Middle Ages, or they had a lot of stuff we didn't have in modern societies. Another example that involves some degree of decentralization within a more overarching state system is the Ottoman Turks. Theoretically, the Ottoman Empire was a Sunni Islamic empire. It was theoretically under Sharia law. But being pragmatists, the Ottomans had a system they called the millets that were they more or less allowed different ethnic and religious groups to pretty much govern themselves, sort of a system of home rule. That is, as long as you're not trying to overthrow the government, you can pretty much do what you want. In Islam, they have this concept called the people of the book, which basically means non-Muslims who were still okay because they were sort of like forerunners to Islam. They include in that the Christians, the Jews, some of the Zoroastrians, some of the early pre-Islamic monotheist religions. And they can get pretty pragmatic with this. Like at one point, I think the Ottomans even decided, the Hindus can be people of the book too, because some of them are kind of sort of monotheists. So okay, good enough. But you had the Ottoman millet system where different people of different cultures were able to practice self-rule. Now, again, I'm sure some progressive types listen to this and say, but they had this, that, or the other thing. Yeah, they did. It was the Middle Ages. Even in traditional China, while China was always something of always had the concept of the emperor and the mandate from heaven and that kind of stuff, China did not necessarily have historically a very obtrusive state system. I think in part that was because they didn't really have a unitary religion. Like when Christian missionaries from the West first started going to China, they thought, this is weird. They don't have any religion here. but they just had a much different approach. They just had their ancestral traditions and folk traditions and that kind of stuff. And in traditional China, you'd find a different set of religions for every village. Like, well, this village worships these gods, and the village up the street worships these gods, and that kind of thing. That's another example. Of course, in early America, before the westward expansion really consolidated itself, you had all these utopian colonies and religious communities and things like that spread out in different places, all these different kinds of experimental societies. In the Middle Ages, you had the medieval leagues, the Hanseatic League and the Lombard League and all these kinds of things. I mean, they were really just basically trade confederations. In modern societies, you have these microstates like Liechtenstein and Andorra and places like that. The question is, to what degree can those exist outside being under the umbrella of larger states? Like you could say, well, the real reason somewhere like Liechtenstein survives is because it's under the European umbrella, which is under the NATO umbrella. I don't know that a neighboring regime like the Third Reich would necessarily would uphold the sovereignty of Liechtenstein, but so there's always issues like that. But yeah, you can find plenty of examples of all kinds of societies where you have power spread out and dispersed among groups, localities, regions, things like that. Of course, there's political and economic power. I do think that when you're talking about decentralization of political power, you do need to think about economic power as well, because you can have a decentralized political system of political power, but then you have very exploitive local elites. And I gave the example earlier of in a lot of local communities in the United States, cities and counties, towns, those are just basically oligopolies of local real estate interests and local businesses and local banks and that kind of stuff. And if you look at how laws are structured, zoning laws, business licensing laws, traffic laws, it's all seems to be about trying to, privilege the people who have the greatest access to city council and that kind of stuff. So, and protect more middle class lifestyle interests and those kinds of things. So economic power does matter, but there are plenty of examples historically and from the contemporary world of societies where power has been spread out to some degree and where you don't have huge concentrations of wealth or political power.
We're over an hour here, so I guess this will be my final question here. And that should be sort of, I'd say, the personal characteristic of the elites themselves. You brought up you threw, I think was it Swithin or you said something like, no, it was you said that, like they were misogynists or they were, you were speaking of the ancient Greeks there. And that's probably true, of course, it's probably true much more than today. Although maybe in a way it's not, it's still, if you take certain degrees, it's still the same here. But, or would you say the elites are mainly, this might be too big of a question for the final question, are the elites more elite because they're kind of, and there's sort of ways I hear the left in my head, or not in my head necessarily, but, accusing me of like all sorts of wrong thing by even formulating this question. Are the elites a sort of class of people, or are they just sort of a result of of a system? Because on the one hand, you have the Bidens and the Clintons, or even like the Bezos. They're all quite intelligent. They're all it's hard to easily say there are, but are they intelligent as James Madison? Probably not. Probably James Madison or someone like that. The sort of founding dynasties are generally fairly smart. I think it's founding dynasties of economic. The initial generations, I think one family lost all the money within 2 generations. So would you say the elites, and this is where Jordan Peterson gets in trouble, or not in trouble too, he'll say that certain lobsters have hierarchies here, and that therefore, now a lot of the left-wing people would point out that he himself is sort of a basket case, and this is sort of, just because that's true doesn't mean that you need all these other elites here. Although some of the right-wing correspondents would say it is. But what would you make of that? Is it kind of like are the elites we see, could they be explained away by personal things, or are they just more, you said that that certain economic rules prop them up and are used to protect them. If they didn't have them, they would go away. Now, I would say that they went away, maybe different elites would arise, and maybe those elites could be less or more agreeable. Sean Gabb was once asked, he was defending the aristocracies of the past. He said, someone asked, I think the Libertarian Alliance asked, would you want to live there? And Sean Gabb said, I'm not sure. If you sent me back in there, maybe I would hate them just as much as I hate the Clintons or the Boris Johnson I do today. But what would you make of the elites? It seems like elites happen throughout history. Could they be explained by sort of personality traits, competence traits? What would you say about the elites themselves? Not necessarily, or is it the system that creates them? It's not. They're not just a sort of aberration. Because you have the man on the street who's just sort of like you're a school teacher or a factory worker, and then you have Jeff Bezos or King Louis XIV. There seems to be a category difference between those people, or maybe there isn't. What would you make of that kind of analysis, Keith?
Well, I wrote an essay that dealt with this issue some years ago, because there was this guy, this far left guy, sort of like a fascist watchdog type of guy some years ago, who wrote a very extensive critique of my work, or at least my work up until that point. And I wrote a rebuttal to him where I was talking about some of these issues. And I outlined a theory that I called the theory of the sheep, wolves, and owls. And what I argued was that most people are essentially sheep. And meaning that most people get their ideas about what is good and bad, right and wrong, from cues that are taken from leaders and peers that they perceive to be legitimate. I mean, there's a reason, for example, why most people in certain parts of the world are Muslim, and most people in other parts of the world are Christian or Hindu, or have this or that set of values about different things. Most people follow the norms of the family that they come from, the community they're from, the culture they're from, the norms of the time period in which they live, and that's just what people do. I mean, most people are like sheep in the sense that, they want food and shelter and entertainment, and maybe they want their own family or children or whatever to be taken care of. But beyond that, they don't really think abstractly. They follow the norms of what they're accustomed to. That's what most people seem to do. Whether that's good or bad, I think is not really a relevant issue. It's just more descriptive. That's what people do. You have other people that I call owls, and these are people that are capable of rising above this kind of herd mentality. That is, people who question existing norms, go against the grain, those kinds of things. And these kinds of people are rare. You don't have that many people who say, look at the norms of their particular society and say, no, I don't agree with this. This is wrong. This is not good. Now, I'm not saying everybody that goes against existing norms is necessarily on the right track or necessarily a superior person. I'm not saying that at all. But you do find a minority of people that are capable of rising above groupthink, herdthink, the promptings of leaders and authority figures in a way that's far more significant than what you find among most people. And I think it's often these people who are the primary agents of real change or reform or innovation in society. And then there's a third category of people that I call wolves. And these are the people who are most likely to become powerful. These are people that are aggressive, ruthless, predatory, amoral, self-centered, self-seeking. These are the people who do what's necessary to advance their own interests. They're not as worried about deferring to group norms, but then they don't really think necessarily on the same kind of abstract way that a person I call an owl might think. These are just people that are about looking out for number one, and they tend to be of above average intelligence, and they tend to be good at getting what they want. That, I think, is where most people who are part of the elite come from. Most people who are part of the elite, whether it's political figures, whether it's business leaders, whether it's high-ranking officials in institutions generally, I think most of them are wolf personalities. Now, they're dependent on a whole lot of sheep, and there may be some owls who manage to blend in among them, but I think the wolf personality type is really the foundation of what makes the kind of person who becomes an elite. One example is the mafia. All right, now in the mafia, what makes someone get to the top of the mafia? Well, basically, they shoot the people who are their competitors. They're cunning enough, and they have enough guile, and they're calculating enough that they're able to outcalculate their rivals, and that's how they eventually become the boss of a crime family or something like that. And I think it works the same way in most institutions. Maybe not with that level of extremity, like maybe the way you make it to the top of a corporation is you just become a really cutthroat businessman, or alternately you become somebody who's just a sycophant to someone like that. Maybe you don't actually have to kill anybody or something of that nature. But I think that's where elites on average come from. They come from these kind of wolf personalities that are basically just aggressive self-seekers. And if you look at the personal lives of so many elites, that's what you see. If you look at the background of the Clintons, if you look at the background of Donald Trump, if you look at the background of Richard Nixon, you see that. You see that these are self-seeking individuals that manage to become powerful just largely through hustling the system. And you also see other people who seem to have been born into a system of privilege. One obvious example is the former U.S. President George W. Bush. That guy was a complete moron, and it was only because he was from a prominent family, a prominent political family, that he eventually got to be president of the United States. If you look at someone like Barack Obama, he was basically just an empty suit who was ambitious. He was no different than your guy who's working his way up the corporate ladder, and he found the right sponsors to sort of groom him to become the president eventually. And it works the same way in most countries and most societies and most institutions. It's in the government, it's in other institutions. Now, one of the things you said that I think was interesting is about how you often find the founding generation of elites that create a new system, and then that deteriorates over time. You do see an interesting pattern there as well. My theory is that revolutions tend to happen when you have an upwardly mobile middle class or upwardly mobile sectors of society that have their political ambitions frustrated. I think that's what led to the revolution in France. The American Revolution, I think, was rooted in that. The Cromwell Revolution, the Russian Revolution. I think most revolutions, mass revolutions that I'm familiar with, you typically had a rising sector of society that had its political ambitions frustrated by some sort of pre-existing elite that had become corrupt or impervious to reform, and that's how you get revolutions. You could compare the founding generations of Americans with the kind of political leaders we have today. And if you read George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and guys like that, compare them with Joe Biden and Donald Trump and Barack Obama, you see what pathetic mediocrities our American political leaders are today. But it's like that everywhere. If you compare the founders of the Soviet Union, Lenin, Trotsky, whatever else could be said about them, right? They were intelligent. They had the talent and ability to carry out a revolution, seize power, create a state of their own, and do the things that they did. If you compare Lenin and Trotsky and Bukharin and some of the early Soviet leaders with the later Soviet leaders, of the 1980s, when they're all a bunch of geriatric pillheads that, like one guy gets appointed premier and dies 6 months later than another one. It's the same process. You do see that institutions and organizations do tend to deteriorate from their founding. You see that you'll find a new generation that comes along, pushes out some previous generation that had deteriorated. Then they start a new system that's somewhat revolutionary or dynamic or whatever, and then that deteriorates over time. You see that everywhere, and I do think that's interesting because what happens is that once a system is established, it's easier and easier for mediocrities to become part of that establishment because the next generation after the founding generation, they didn't create the system, they inherited it, or they got to where they are by brown-nosing the people on top or something like that. So I think that's why systems tend to deteriorate over time.
Thank you for joining us, Keith. That's been a very interesting discussion. I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you'd enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. Finally, if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com.